Um, so today I'll be talking a little bit about how we design curriculum for a public school, specifically, I believe, for computer science. So a little bit first before we begin is I want to talk about what these things called standards are. You might already know what they are or a little bit about them, but in essence, standards are the published laws or regulations for what students need to be learning in the classroom. So governments usually set these. Organizations will also like supply some ideas for the governments, but governments will um, enact into law what those standards are and what have to be met. These are usually set by the state or local governments. Sometimes federal government gets involved, but recently they've been taking a back seat to this, so mostly state governments are involved. In our specific case, because we're in Indiana, we're talking about Indiana state standards. They're legally required to be updated every 6 years. I believe they're looking to be updated sometime soon in the next year or so when I'm recording this, because they were updated last in 2016, if I recall correctly. Um, and so they do get updated quite often and they add in a lot of new things all the time. So it's important to also, if you're writing curriculum, to make sure you're following that. For Indiana, like many states, we have standards for the core subjects. So science, English, social studies, math. We also have ones for health, art, and some other stuff like home ec and stuff. We'll notice we also have a separate computer science standard. It's separate from science. That's mainly because science, English, social studies, and math have been legally required, where computer science is optional. However, I do believe they just passed a law requiring computer science in all schools, or to at least meet some extent of that computer science curriculum. So it is starting to become more important in Indiana that we teach that computer science content. So a lot of schools, especially schools in rural areas where we don't see a computer science division in the schools, to start finding ways to teach that without really having the resources or backbone that they usually have to teach it. So that's a great place for us as an organization or us as students to step in and possibly help some of these teachers because they don't have a background in computer science. So that's a good thing for us to look out to, kind of a tangent though. So the reason why we care about these standards in terms of when we're in the grand scope of curriculum, I guess, is because these standards are what drive accreditation, really. It's not fully what drives accreditation, but I would say it's almost 80% of accreditation. So just like in college, where our college is accredited by an institution so that our degrees not meeting, so too our public schools, they're accredited, and that's how they get their public funding, and that's how students with high school diplomas know they have meaning. And so if a school is not meeting these state standards or these legal standards that have been passed, the school can lose its accreditation. Recently, in the past, this has been a huge no-no, even though students might not be meeting state standards. They haven't been de-accrediting schools, but in the past decade, they have been starting to take that leap. They've been starting to decredit public schools that are not meeting standards. So it's a big thing for school admins right now and school boards to make sure they're meeting those standards. They're finally being really held accountable to a more extreme extent. So they're really pressuring their teachers to help find ways to meet these standards. So the way this pathway usually works is governments accredit the schools and they tell the schools what they need to do to get accredited, and those school admins are going to tell their teachers and faculty what they need to do in order to meet that accredited, to help them meet those accreditation standards. And so this is where curriculum is developed right here by the teachers, right? So the teachers are the ones who are coming with ways to satisfy those standards, and that's what we call curriculum. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Um, and so the reason why when we design our own curriculum that we want to think about standards is because they're very important to teachers. Teachers need to show the administration that they're meeting these standards and what standards are being met by the students. And so they want lesson plans that have those standards mentioned and satisfied. So if we ignore mentioning or how to satisfy those standards, the teachers aren't going to be very fond of using any lesson plans we develop. Um, and that's why a lot of third-party lessons plans that we see clearly lay out um, standards, usually on a national level because it's national curriculum, but more local places will lay out state standards as well. So you can find curriculum with state standards met or described in it. And so when we are trying to design our own, if we really want teachers to use it, including standards is a very important thing. So understanding what they are for us is important as well. And there's also some other stuff we want to add into curriculum to kind of help make teachers open to using it. So again, before I continue talking about what makes a good lesson plan with standards and other stuff, we'll just touch a little bit on curriculum for standards again, because I know it can get kind of confusing for some people. Um, we're designing curriculum specifically And curriculum is what's being taught. Standards, which are set by the government, are very, very broad guidelines on what should be taught. So you can think of it like in this example here, they have the curriculum standard. It's just develop a simple understanding of an algorithm, right? That is very, very broad. I mean, that could be, oh, let's do binaries. That could be something in high school, like let's do binary search. Something as simple in like kindergarten as like, let's talk about like incrementation, or let's just talk about, like they say, a sequence of events. And then I guess this also adds using computer-free exercises, so it'd probably be for younger audiences. But so this is very, very broad stuff. And so when we talk about curriculum, we'll have, okay, so the students are going to do some activity where they're repeating instructions from an instructor, and they're going to talk about how that's kind of like codes with like loops and stuff like that. So they're learning very basic algorithms without using computers. And so, but you could do a different algorithm that's not loop based. You could do something else. You can do like a sorting thing. You can do searching, all that kind of stuff. So it's very, very broad in terms of the standard to satisfy, which makes it kind of sometimes difficult to design curriculum because you're like, okay, well, what does this specifically satisfy? It's not very, the cut and paste is like one activity satisfies only one standard. It's very broad. So that's why it's very important for us to link those standards as we write the curriculum, because doing it retroactively, taking the curriculum and like searching through the standards to satisfy can be time consuming, and teachers don't have a lot of time to waste. As you probably know, teachers in America are not, or teachers in the United States are not very uh, given a lot of time and resources to get a lot of their work done in many places. So they really are looking for options that will not take them an extra time and not cost extra resources when they are coming up with some of these curriculums, especially for teachers who are unfamiliar with computer science. So we want to make sure we get through as many of the hoops for them as possible that may help make sure that they can get computer science content to their students without them going way above and beyond what's expected of them already. Right, so what makes a good lesson plan for these teachers? So I've talked to a lot of teachers about this. They all have different preferences, of course, but the general consensus I always get is that there's two things we want to include that are the most important. And so, of course, one of them is standards, because I spent so much time talking about it already. But the other most important thing is resources and, like, I guess also kind of a summary of stuff, right? So at the very beginning of the lesson plan, teachers are going to want to know what's being used. So I'm familiar with science, so this is just like when we write scientific papers, we have a materials and methods section. It's kind of similar to this. In essence, you want to make sure the teachers know the materials required to do this lesson before they start. Schools, of course, are funded differently. For example, the West Lafayette School District here is very, very well funded. They have a lot of equipment at their disposal to do a lot of different things, whereas rural schools do not have any of that equipment. I know there are schools that I've worked at who don't even have laptops or computers for students. They don't even have like Google accounts or anything. They don't work online. They work totally off the net. They have no access to computers and stuff like that. And so when we design curriculum, we want to make sure that if computers are required or materials that might be costly or not present in an average classroom are required, we want to make sure the teachers know ahead of time what that is. And as you can see here, that can vary down to some very basic stuff. Paper and tape is listed, gumdrop and toothpicks is listed. So you really want to make sure they know like this, like you need this kind of extra stuff so they can also prep ahead of time and get all the stuff out that they need, but also so that they can realize like, okay, I don't have gumdrops and toothpicks. I need to go get approval to buy those, or I need to go spend my own money in that if they're willing to do that. Um, and two, like again, like if there's something massive on here, like you need a shake table, you can't just get a shake table like the day before, and so you don't want to like start the lesson or be reading through the lesson, starting to invest in it, only to find out halfway through their planning process for themselves that they need something that wasn't listed and that they don't have access to, and really can't get access to. So we want to make sure those are laid out very clear. This one also is kind of helpful. I ripped it from code.org. It shows what students need and what teachers are going to need. So this like what they have to print and all the other attachments to this lesson plan that they'll need to have. So that's helpful as well. But just having in general a materials and resource section is very important. As well too, having not necessarily breaking it down to this extreme, but having a section where you talk about how much time you think it's going to take for each part is kind of important. So schools have different periods of length for classes. Where I went to school, our classes ended up being 130, not 130 minutes, 1.5 hours. That's 90 minutes. So, not your average 50-minute class, almost double. So in that scenario, like a 50-minute lesson plan is not enough content to fill the whole day. So you want to make sure you explain how long this content should take to teach so they can get a rough idea of what the expectations are and they can adjust themselves. They will adjust themselves, which is why you should make these guidelines, again, kind of vague. I'm not talking like a detailed step-by-step, minute-by-minute guideline, but a very vague guideline of how much you kind of expect to take that they will be able to tweak. And then, of course, adding standards to your plan. And when I say adding standards, I mean like standards as in a lot of standards, and personalize them based on where we're targeting. Again, this is the code.org example. So in this case, they're using national standards, several different organizations, national standards actually, in case your school determines that they want a different one and whatnot. So it can be helpful for us too if we're writing curriculum for Indiana to include national standards, especially from these third-party nonprofit groups that investigate standards for computer science. But including state standards is also relevant for us because we're targeting Indiana schools. So really, we can also include those as well and personalize it a little bit more. And then, as I mentioned here, many standards are listed, not just such focus on computer science, although computer science standards are also nice. I believe these are also, I don't know if I have any listed here, but there's also standards on this page. This isn't all of them for this lesson plan. There's also other standards that are like, talk about the scientific method or do like, analyze with a write-up, stuff like that. And so you can include more broad standards, and you want to include as many that satisfy as possible. Although it doesn't necessarily mean that the content is better, schools have for some reason decided that more standards means better, which is just some kind of political token, I really think, but that's how it is nowadays. So they really like to see a lot of standards being satisfied with this type of coursework, get as much in as they can to make sure that these students are meeting those standards. So listing as many as you can is helpful for them. The teachers will single out the ones they're most interested in themselves. So just listing as many as you can find that do match is good. So I wouldn't overkill it to the point where you're writing like 3 to 4 pages of standards, but a half a page to a page of standards is not unheard of. Especially when you're listing multiple organization standards. So it's good to have those standards in there for them so that they can pick and choose the ones that they really wanted to satisfy, and then the rest is just icing on the cake for them. And then, yeah. And then the last part I want to talk about, because in terms of making lesson plans, there's so many ways to do them and so many things you can add. I don't want to talk about what makes one lesson plan superior over another in terms of what's specifically in it, because teachers have different preferences in content and people have different preferences in how to write and they teach. But the last aspect that when I talk to teachers have always talked about making a good lesson plan is that the procedure is easy to follow like a recipe. And they literally have told me, I know it's cheesy, but they literally say like a recipe. And this is especially important for us in computer science. And that is because teachers, the teachers who will be teaching computer science, especially again in the rural schools or schools where computer science education has not been done before, they're not going to have the resources to hire a teacher who has computer science background. It is very unlikely. And they're also, in many cases, probably not likely to have the resources to really teach a very advanced computer science course. They might lack the computers, they might lack the programs, they might lack any faculty with expertise or something like that. So it's very important that these processes are easy to follow and they don't require a lot of external knowledge per se. So it's not like me going to a computer science lecture and the professor's like whipping out huge words, all that kind of stuff. That foundational knowledge, in some scenarios could be expected if it's clearly a more advanced lesson plan, but for a lot of the basic stuff where we're targeting younger kids, we want to make sure the lessons are easy because these teachers probably have very minimal background in computer science. And so for them, it's not going to be easy to read a lesson plan that is kind of convoluted and complex. A lot of times, in fact, I've heard that teachers are learning this as they read the lesson plan. So when I work in some rural schools helping teach computer science to teachers, so they can teach their students. They really are learning as we go. Especially now that rural schools will be required to satisfy these standards, I can tell you that the schools are not giving them the money they need. So we want to make sure these programs are easy to follow, these curriculums are easy to follow for the teachers as well when we write them. And so the most easy way to compare this, I guess, is a recipe, right? So that we want the teachers to be able to replicate what we're doing very easily, but not necessarily to the point where it's so detailed that it's gone crazy. So you don't have to be like, use this specific type of paper, yada yada, use this specific type of thing. This should take exactly 3 minutes and 38 seconds. Be like a recipe where it's, the recipe is clear to follow, but there's obvious places where you can make tweaks, right? You can add your own spices, you can add your own twist. So some teachers might be more advanced to be willing to add those twists, or, they know their students and they're like, an activity where we sit for 5 minutes ain't gonna work. So I'm gonna change it up to doing something where we stand. So adding the ability for them to tweak that, so keeping it kind of, not necessarily like to the point where everything depends on doing exactly, but making it clearly followable is very important. Um, and then the other thing I know everyone also always tells me is include pictures and worksheets, because worksheets have been kind of going in and out of popularity in public school because of wasting paper and virtual activities. But if there's anything you're doing that clearly will benefit from students filling out a worksheet, worksheets are very important. So including those worksheets yourself instead of expecting teachers to make them is very important. I know, like, this looks like a really bad picture. I mean, not a bad picture, but I mean, it's clearly a very basic format for a worksheet, but this probably also took like 15 minutes for your average Microsoft Word user, which is what most teachers are going to be. So if they don't have to make the worksheets, they're more likely to use your work, and they're more happy to use it because they don't have to spend time doing that themselves, which is what they're really looking for. So making sure our lessons plans are followable and can include content and worksheets and pictures that they can just copy out of those lesson plans are all good things that teachers like to see. In terms of what content you put in, however you think would be able to best teach a subject, go for it. Just make sure that it's easily followable for someone who is not an expert but has an advanced a college education, but not necessarily in science or computer science, and then including pictures so that the students that will be using this curriculum can benefit from those diagrams as well. And the last thing I want to touch on is multi-day lesson plans. These are becoming more and more things we see online that third-party organizations are offering. It used to be that teachers would do this in-house more, but we're seeing more third-party work in this area. So when we're talking about multi-day lesson plans, they're really built the same way as a normal lesson plan, except we redo every section for each day. So you would probably want, so when we do this, well, when I've done this with some colleagues of mine, what we do is we include a header section that includes all the materials for all days and possibly what days they're used on. And then we include all the standards that are met and on which day they're met. And then we do a lesson plan for each day individually. So we'll relist materials and standards on each one of those days, and then we'll do the whole lesson plan just for that day. And then on consecutive days, we might reference lesson plan from day one and stuff like that, but we do each day as a different lesson plan. That way teachers can break up the days over multiple large time periods. Like, we're going to do this every Friday for a month rather than like 4 days in a row, and stuff like that. But really make sure that the teachers can easily follow that again. So if you're doing multiple days, make it flexible so they can break it up here and there, and make sure it's easy to follow, or that they could just pick 1 or 2 days that they like out of this for them and stuff like that. So I think that's the last slide I have in terms of content, but I'll just stress one last time because I've probably said enough, but it's very important that the teachers see your content and see that you put work into it and that you're trying to make life easier for them. I know when I've done work with this with students in the past, I've seen a lot of students who just go like, oh yeah, this is how I would teach the content. Here's a list of like how I would teach the content. Teachers don't want that. They don't care for it. And in all honesty, I've seen teachers who just get offended by that and never want to work with your group again. You need to make sure that these standards are present, that we talked about earlier, and you need to make sure that it is a clear and easy process to follow. Just like a recipe book, because I guess I haven't used that analogy enough, but just like a recipe book, if the recipes suck and no one can follow them without like a degree from some French cooking school, no one's using it. So make sure that it's usable for an average teacher and that the content that they want, which are those standards, are in there so that they can benefit from them themselves. Because there's no point for you to waste all your time making standards that no one wants, making curriculum that no one wants to use. So make sure you invest into it and put love and labor into it so that it's good content that teachers are open and willing to use. And don't be afraid to copy a standard like curriculum from other places like code.org and shape it a little differently, but really go out there and make some good curriculum if you're looking to do this.